humidity of the city clung to the pavement like a damp shroud, but Naledi Dlamini moved through it with the focused intensity of a storm. She was exactly 4 minutes late for the fashion gala of the decade, and in her world, 4 minutes was an eternity. Her heels clicked a frantic rhythm against the rain-slicked sidewalk until she skidded to a halt beside a parked Maybach. It was a monolith of matte black steel, its windows so deeply tinted they looked like slabs of obsidian. To anyone else, the car was a warning, a sign of immense, dangerous wealth that demanded a wide berth. To Naledi, it was simply the most expensive mirror she had ever seen. She leaned in, her face inches from the glass. With a steady hand, she uncapped a gold tube of midnight crimson. She didn't see the way the car's chassis sat low under the weight of reinforced armor plating. She didn't notice the two black SUVs idling a discreet distance behind it. She only saw the slight smudge on her upper lip. As she glided the pigment across her skin, she tilted her head, checking her reflection from multiple angles, adjusting a stray coil of hair with a confident, self-assured smirk. She gave herself a final, lingering wink, pressed her lips together to set the color, and hurried away into the gala's golden light. Inside the car, the air was cold enough to frost. Two bodyguards in the front seat had their hands white-knuckled on their weapons, their eyes darting to the man in the back. They waited for the command to clear the perimeter, for the order to handle the woman who had the audacity to touch the boss's window. But Choi Kang-Soo didn't move. The silent reaper sat in the shadows, his face illuminated only by the faint, filtered glow of the streetlights hitting the glass. He was staring at the exact spot where Naledi's face had been. For years, people had looked at this car with terror, with greed, or with a desperate need to get away. No one had ever looked at it with such casual, beautiful indifference. He reached out, his gloved fingers tracing the faint, heart-shaped fog left by her breath on the window. A slow, genuine smile broke across his face, a smile that didn't belong on a man who traded in blood and secrets. It was a look of pure, boyish captivation. "Don't start the car," Kang-Soo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that brooked no argument. He watched her retreating figure, the vibrant red of her dress cutting through the gray city fog like a blade. "I want to see where she's going." The predator wasn't hunting. For the first time in his life, he was simply following the light. The heavy door of the Grand Emerald Hotel swallowed Naledi, but the silence inside the Maybach remained absolute, save for the low hum of the climate control. In the front seat, Jin-ho's hand hovered over the door handle, his muscles coiled like a spring. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting the cold, unreadable gaze of the man in the back. "Sir, she touched the glass," Jin-ho whispered, his voice laced with a professional edge. "Should we bring her back for questioning?" In the world of the Silent Reaper, an unidentified approach was a security breach. A touch was a threat, but Kang-Soo didn't respond with the clinical violence his men expected. Instead, he leaned forward, his silhouette cutting through the darkness of the cabin. He ignored his men, his focus locked on the ghost of a crimson mark left on the reinforced pane. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kang-Soo raised his right hand. He didn't point or shout, he simply flattened his palm in the air, a silent command that froze his security detail in their tracks. The tension in the car exhaled all at once, replaced by a confused, heavy stillness. Kang-Soo didn't care about the breach. He was mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated vanity of the act. For the last decade, his life had been a series of calculated moves, betrayals, and the suffocating weight of fear. People didn't breathe near him, they trembled. Yet this woman had used his primary defense, a window designed to stop a sniper's bullet, to fix her makeup. She had treated his aura of terror as a convenience. He reached out, tracing the outline of the lip print with his thumb on the interior side of the glass, as if trying to touch the warmth she'd left behind. A shadow of a smile, rare and dangerous, tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't the smirk of a killer, but the look of a man who had just found a crack in the dark wall of his own existence. "She didn't even look inside," Kang-Soo murmured, more to himself than his men. "Sir," Jin-ho asked, confused. "She wasn't looking for me," Kang-Soo clarified, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly hum. "She was looking at herself. She has no idea I exist, Jin-ho. And yet, she's the only person in this city who hasn't looked at me with fear today. He watched the red lip print, a vibrant splash of color against his monochrome world. It was a brand, a mark of defiance he hadn't asked for but couldn't look away from. The curiosity wasn't a choice, it was a sudden, violent hunger. He needed to know if that same fire in her eyes remained when the lights went out. "Find out which agency is handling the gala's PR," he commanded, his eyes never leaving the spot where she had disappeared. "And get me her name. I want to see how long that confidence lasts when she realizes who was behind the mirror." The morning light in the offices of Dlamini and Associates was usually clinical and sharp, but today it felt like a spotlight. Naledi stood in the center of the glass-walled boardroom, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the thick, cream-colored envelope resting on the mahogany table. It was hand-delivered, sealed with a heavy wax stamp in a shade of black, so deep it looked like a void. "Naledi, do you realize what this is?" her boss, Sarah, whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "The Choi Syndicate doesn't hire publicists, they don't do image work, they operate in the shadows, but this contract, it's 10 times our annual revenue." Naledi reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, expensive grain of the paper. She had spent years clawing her way up the fashion PR ladder, surviving on espresso and ambition, but this wasn't just a promotion. It was a coronation. The mysterious benefactor had requested her by name to handle the transition of their private equity holdings into the public luxury sector. "I don't understand," Naledi murmured, flipping the card over. "Why me?" As she turned the heavy cardstock, a small Polaroid-style photograph slid out from the folds of the contract. Naledi's breath hitched. It wasn't a photo of a person. It was a close-up shot of a car window, a matte black armored surface she recognized instantly. In the center of the frame, illuminated by the flash, was a faint crimson smudge, a lip print. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. The memory of the previous night rushed back, the rain-slicked pavement, the frantic touch-up, and the casual wink she had tossed at her own reflection. She hadn't been looking at a mirror, she had been looking at a man. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The owner of that car hadn't just seen her, he had been watching her. He had been inches away, separated only by a layer of glass, while she treated his terrifying world like a vanity station. The red invitation wasn't just a career-defining account, it was a summons. Naledi looked back at the contract, noticing for the first time the signature at the bottom. The ink was sharp, aggressive, and final, Choi Kang-Soo. She felt a shiver of pure, cold adrenaline. She had wanted to reach the top of the world, but she hadn't realized she'd be invited there by the man who owned the foundations. The empowerment she had felt the night before, that fierce, self-possessed confidence, was now tinged with the realization that the predator hadn't just let her go. He had marked her, and now he was inviting her into the den. "Naledi," Sarah asked, noticing her sudden pallor, "are you okay?" Naledi slowly tucked the photo into her blazer pocket, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice regaining its edge. "I just need to buy a new suit. I have a feeling this client expects nothing less than perfection." The elevator climbed 60 floors in a silence so absolute it made Naledi's ears pop. When the doors slid open, she wasn't met with the bustling chaos of a typical corporate firm. Instead, the penthouse office of the Choi Syndicate was a cathedral of glass and cold marble, overlooking a city that looked like a toy set from this height. The air was pressurized, smelling faintly of expensive cedar and something metallic, like the ozone before a strike of lightning. Naledi smoothed the front of her charcoal gray blazer, her fingers grazing the Polaroid hidden in her pocket. She refused to let her hand shake. She was a professional, she was the best in her field. If Choi Kang-Soo wanted a publicist, she would give him a masterpiece. At the end of the long hall, a set of heavy ebony doors opened without a sound. Kang-Soo was silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sun casting his shadow across the polished floor like a dark carpet. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching a hawk circle the skyscrapers below. "You're exactly on time, Miss Dlamini," he said. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to hum in the floorboards. a rare trait in your industry. He turned slowly. The silent reaper didn't look like a monster, he looked like a king. His suit was tailored with lethal precision, and his eyes were a sharp, piercing obsidian that seemed to strip away her professional veneer in a single glance. "Mr. Choi," Naledi replied, her voice steady despite the frantic drumming in her chest. She took a seat across from his desk, crossing her legs with practiced grace. "I've reviewed the contract. Your transition into the luxury sector is ambitious, but my strategy." "I didn't bring you here for your strategy, Naledi." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. The movement was slow, predatory. He didn't look at her notes or her portfolio. He looked at her mouth. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the space between them felt charged with enough static to ignite. "I brought you here because you're the only person who has ever looked at my world and seen a mirror," he murmured. A small, dangerous smile played at the corners of his lips, the same smile she had missed through the tinted glass. "And because I find myself surprisingly interested in your taste." Naledi's breath hitched as he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a gold tube. He set it on the table between them. It was the midnight crimson she had used 2 nights ago. "I had it replaced," he said, his gaze dropping to her lips, which were today painted in a soft, defiant nude. "Though I must admit, I prefer the red. It suits a woman who isn't afraid of what's hiding in the shadows." He leaned back, his eyes locking onto hers with a heat that made the climate-controlled room feel like a furnace. "It's a bold choice of lipstick, Miss Dlamini. I'd like to see what other bold choices you're planning to make." The following days were a whirlwind of high-stakes branding meetings and site visits, but Naledi couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, not with the predatory warmth of Kang-Soo, but with something cold and jagged. As she exited a boutique fabric supplier in a quiet corner of the fashion district, the evening air felt uncharacteristically heavy. The street was a narrow vein of cobblestone and shadows, and for the first time, her hyper-independence felt less like a shield and more like a target. A silver sedan with tinted windows, far less refined than the Maybach, screeched to a halt, blocking her path to her own car. 3 men stepped out, their leather jackets smelling of cheap tobacco and aggression. They didn't look like the disciplined professionals of the Choi Syndicate. They looked like street dogs looking for a bone. "Miss Dlamini," the leader sneered, stepping into her personal space. "You've been spending a lot of time with the Reaper. We thought maybe you could give us a message for him, or maybe you're the message." Naledi's heart spiked, her hand tightening around the strap of her laptop bag. She opened her mouth to speak, to assert the poise that usually commanded a room, but the man reached out to grab her arm. He never finished the movement. A black SUV, seemingly appearing from the very bricks of the alleyway, slammed into the silver sedan with a bone-jarring crunch. Before Naledi could even scream, the side door slid open. Jinho and 2 others emerged with the synchronized fluidity of a shadow taking form. There was no shouting, no cinematic posturing, only the terrifying efficiency of high-level violence. In a blur of motion, the 3 men were neutralized, pinned against the cold stone or silenced with a precision that suggested they weren't just being fought, but erased. Naledi stood frozen, her breath hitching in her throat, until a heavy, warm presence settled behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. The scent of cedar and ozone enveloped her. "Keep walking, Naledi," Kang-Soo's voice hummed near her ear, steady and disturbingly calm. "Don't look back. There is a smudge on your shoe. Focus on that." He stepped beside her, his hand lightly touching the small of her back, not to restrain her, but to guide her. He looked entirely bored by the groans of the men behind them, his focus solely on the way the street lamp caught the gold in her hair. "Who were they?" she whispered, her voice trembling as he opened the door to his Maybach for her. "Nobody," Kang-Soo replied, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, protective intensity that made her skin tingle. "They made the mistake of thinking you were a weakness I hadn't accounted for. They won't make it again." As the car pulled away, Naledi looked in the side mirror. The alley was empty. It was as if the threat had never existed, as if the world itself bent to ensure her path remained clear. She realized then that she wasn't just working for a man, She was being curated by a god of the underworld, and he wouldn't let a single speck of dust touch his masterpiece. The grand emerald ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and whispered secrets, but for Naledi, the room had narrowed to a single point of gravity. She stood on the edge of the dance floor, her crimson dress a defiant splash of blood against the monochrome elegance of the city's elite. She had spent the evening playing the role of the perfect publicist, but as the orchestra shifted into a slow, haunting waltz, the air in the room suddenly changed. The crowd parted instinctively, a silent wake forming behind Choi Kang-Soo. He didn't look like a client tonight. He looked like the storm she had been trying to outrun. He reached her without a word, his hand extending in an invitation that felt more like a command. When his palm met hers, the professional veneer she had spent years building shattered. His touch was warm, firm, and dangerously familiar. He pulled her into the dance, his hand settling on the small of her back with a possessive weight that made her breath hitch. They moved with a predatory grace, a silent orbit in the center of a room that had gone suddenly still. "You should leave, Naledi," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that bypassed her ears and settled in her bones. She looked up, meeting the obsidian depth of his gaze. "I have a contract, Mr. Choi. I don't walk away from my commitments." "The contract is paper. This world is fire," he said, his grip tightening just a fraction as he spun her through a turn. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his scent of cedar and ozone enveloping her. "My enemies are no longer looking for my shadow. They are looking for the light I've started to follow. If you stay, you become a target. Run, go back to your mirrors and your fashion shows while you still can." It was a warning, cold and logical, delivered with the ruthlessness of the silent reaper. But as Naledi pulled back to look at him, she saw the lie in his expression. His face was a mask of stoic command, but his eyes, crinkled at the corners, dark with a raw, aching vulnerability, told a different story. They were the same eyes that had watched her from behind the tinted glass, filled with a desperate, silent plea. He was telling her to run, but his soul was begging her to hold on. The high stakes of his world pressed in on them, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi and the watchful eyes of hidden guards blurring into a chaotic mosaic. Naledi realized then that the power inversion was complete. The man who owned the city was terrified of losing the one person who wasn't afraid to look him in the eye. "I'm not running," she whispered, her voice steady as she leaned into the strength of his chest. Kang-Soo let out a jagged breath, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, forbidden second. The glass walls hadn't just broken, they had been pulverized. They were no longer client and consultant, light and shadow. They were two people standing in the center of a war zone, choosing to dance while the world began to burn. The haunting lilt of the waltz was still vibrating in the air when the first pane of the ballroom's grand skylight shattered. The sound wasn't a crack, it was an explosion of crystal that rained down like diamonds soaked in moonlight. Before the first scream could even leave Naledi's throat, the warm, protective hand on her waist transformed. Kang-Soo didn't flinch. His reaction was a terrifying, practiced fluidness. In one motion he pivoted, his arm sweeping Naledi behind the heavy oak trunk of a decorative pillar. The boyish grin she had glimpsed behind the car window, the man who had admired her vanity, was gone. In his place stood the silent reaper, a creature of cold calculation and lethal intent. Two men in waiters' uniforms lunged from the crowd, the silver of suppressed pistols glinting in the chandelier light. Naledi watched, her back pressed against the cold stone as Kang-Soo moved. It wasn't a fight, it was a harvest. He didn't use a gun. He used a discarded steak knife from a nearby table and the sheer force of his momentum. He moved with a horrifying efficiency, his strikes landing in the softest, most vital points with a precision that turned the stomach. A spray of warmth hit Naledi's shoulder. She looked down, her breath hitching in a silent sob. A jagged, dark blossom of blood had bloomed across the vibrant crimson of her dress, the two reds clashing in a sickening display of reality. Kang-Soo stood over the fallen men, his chest barely heaving. He turned back to her, and for a second, Naledi didn't recognize him. His eyes were void of the vulnerability she had seen moments ago on the dance floor. They were flat, obsidian mirrors reflecting nothing but the carnage he had just orchestrated. He reached out to check her for injuries, his hands stained with the same dark liquid ruining her gown. I told you to run, he said, his voice stripped of all warmth. It was a rasp of dry earth and steel. Naledi recoiled, her heart shattering in a way the glass hadn't. She had known he was dangerous, had romanticized the shadow from the safety of her high-rise office, but the physical reality of his world was a betrayal of the man she thought she was beginning to love. He wasn't a misunderstood antihero. He was a monster who had optimized the art of ending lives. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the blood on her red dress. The brief flicker of pain that crossed Kang-Soo's face was gone before she could be sure it was ever there. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer comfort. He simply signaled to Jinho, who appeared from the smoke with a submachine gun leveled. "Get her to the safe house," Kang-Soo commanded, turning his back on her to face the next wave of attackers. The wall between them was back, thicker and more impenetrable than the armored glass of his Maybach. Naledi realized then that the man who fell for a girl in a mirror was a ghost, and the man standing in the blood was the only truth left. The safe house was a masterpiece of architectural isolation, a brutalist fortress of concrete and glass perched on a jagged cliffside far from the city's neon heartbeat. Inside, the air was filtered and still, smelling of nothing but sterilized luxury. For 3 days, Naledi paced the perimeter of the living area, her reflection ghosting against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was no longer fixing her lipstick. She was looking for a way out of a cage lined with gold. When the heavy steel door finally hummed open, Kang-Soo entered. He had traded his blood-stained tuxedo for a simple black sweater, but the lethality still clung to him like a second skin. He placed a tray of food on the marble island, his movements silent and precise. "Eat," he said, his voice flat. "You've barely touched anything since the gala." "Is this the part where I thank you?" Naledi's voice was sharp, echoing off the cold walls. She stepped into the light, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You dragged me into a war, Kang-Soo. I saw you kill those men. I saw the look in your eyes. It wasn't self-defense, it was routine." Kang-Soo didn't flinch. He poured a glass of water, the sound of the liquid the only thing breaking the suffocating tension. "It is my reality. I warned you that the light attracts shadows." "Don't give me metaphors," she snapped, moving closer until she could see the faint, jagged scar running along his jawline. "Who are you, truly? Because the man who smiled at me through a car window doesn't exist in this house." Kang-Soo set the glass down with a slow, deliberate click. He turned to face her, and for the first time, the Reaper mask slipped. His eyes weren't obsidian mirrors anymore, they were deep, aching wells of exhaustion. "The man in the car is who I was meant to be," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My father was the head of the syndicate. When I was 12, I watched him burn our house down with my mother inside because she tried to take me away from this life. He sat me in the back of that very Maybach and told me that if I ever wanted to survive, I had to become the fire, not the wood." He stepped toward her, his presence overwhelming, yet strangely fragile. "I spent 15 years systematically dismantling every person who stood in my way until there was nothing left of the boy who liked the sun. I became the Reaper, so no one could ever set fire to my world again." He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near her cheek, not quite touching her. "Then I saw you. You treated my fortress like a mirror. For 5 seconds, I wasn't a monster. I was just a man being seen by a beautiful woman. I've lived in a cage of my own making for 20 years, Naledi. You are the only window I have left." Naledi felt the anger drain out of her, replaced by a hollow, tragic ache. She looked at the man who had been forged in a furnace of his father's making, and she realized the gilded cage wasn't for her. It was the only home he had ever known. The silence of the safe house was shattered not by gunfire, but by the frantic, rhythmic blinking of a red light on the security console. The coup had arrived. Kang-Soo stood in the center of the command room, his fingers flying across a keyboard with the same lethal precision he had used with a blade at the gala. He wasn't looking at weapon systems, he was looking at offshore accounts and digital identity wipes. "The elders have moved," Kang-Soo said, his voice a hauntingly calm rasp. "They believe that by removing me, they can return to the old ways. They think you are the anchor that makes me heavy enough to sink. They're coming to prove it." Naledi stood in the doorway, the golden light of the sunset catching the fear in her eyes. Then we fight. You have Jinho, you have the resources. No, Kang-Soo turned, the shadows of the room carving deep hollows into his face. If I fight, you spend the rest of your life as a trophy for whoever wins. To save the light, I have to let the darkness consume me. He walked toward her, pulling a small, encrypted drive from his pocket and pressing it into her palm. It felt cold against her skin. This is everything. My holdings, my assets, and a new life for you in a city where they don't know the name Choi. There is a car waiting in the underground tunnel. Jinho is already there. What about you? Naledi's voice cracked, her fingers tightening around his. Kang-Soo, what are you doing? The Reaper has to die for the man to live, he whispered. He stepped back, a look of profound, agonizing clarity in his eyes. He reached for a remote detonator on the desk, the failsafe for the safe house's gas lines. The elders need a body, or at least a funeral. If the world believes I burned in this house trying to protect my empire, they will stop looking for the woman who was with me. They will think the fire finally won. You're giving it all up, she realized, the weight of his sacrifice crashing down on her. The empire he had spent 15 years building, the power that kept him safe, he was burning it all to ash just to give her a chance to breathe. You'll have nothing. I'll have a ghost's chance, Kang-Soo said, a ghost of that boyish grin flickering on his lips for one final, fleeting second. He leaned forward, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to her forehead. Now run, Naledi, don't look back at the smoke. Look at the mirror and remember the woman who wasn't afraid. I'll find you in the next life. As the heavy security doors began to seal her into the escape tunnel, she saw him turn back to the monitors, a lonely figure silhouetted against a world about to explode. He wasn't a boss anymore. He was a man stripping off his armor, standing naked in the path of the storm so it wouldn't touch her. Then, the first dull roar of the Foundation charges vibrated through the stone, and the world went black. The skyscrapers of a new city shimmered like jagged diamonds against a twilight sky, their glass facades reflecting a world that had moved on from the name Choi. 1 year had passed since the night the cliffside safe house lit up the horizon like a dying star. Naledi Dlamini stood on the curb outside a premier gallery opening, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi no longer a threat, but a choir that sang for her. She was the undisputed architect of the city's most prestigious brands, a woman whose name meant power, grace, and an ironclad independence. She paused to check her reflection in the darkened window of a luxury sedan idling by the curb. The crimson dress she wore tonight was a custom silk that didn't clashing with blood. It was the color of victory. As she reached into her clutch for her lipstick, her hand paused. She wasn't the frantic girl running late anymore. She was the woman who had survived the fire, and for a second, she looked into the glass with a quiet, knowing smile. She uncapped the familiar gold tube of midnight crimson. Just as she raised it to her lips, a soft, mechanical hum broke the silence of the evening. The rear door of the car didn't just stay closed this time. It swung open with a slow, inviting weight. Naledi's heart skipped a beat, a familiar rush of ozone and cedar-scented air hitting her senses before she even saw him. The interior of the car was a sanctuary of black leather and soft, ambient light. Sitting in the shadows was a man the world believed had been reduced to ash. He wore no suit of armor, no heavy gold watch, just a simple black shirt and a gaze that was entirely, devastatingly clear. "You're late, Naledi," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly hum that felt like coming home. The silent Reaper was dead, buried under the wreckage of a past life. The man sitting there had eyes that no longer mirrored the darkness. They were full of the light he had followed across an ocean and a year of silence. He wasn't a boss, and he wasn't a ghost. He was simply Kang-Soo. Naledi didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the cameras or the gala or the empire she had built. She stepped into the car, the heavy door sealing out the noise of the world with a final, muted thud. As the car pulled away into the stream of traffic, she leaned over and pressed a crimson-stained kiss to his cheek, leaving a mark that would never be wiped away. Behind the tinted glass, they were finally invisible, two reflections that had found their way into the same frame. If you enjoyed this journey from the shadows into the light, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more cinematic stories of love and redemption.